So meanwhile, shalom everybody, and welcome those who are coming from abroad and to Israel, and those who are coming from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And the meeting today will be held in English, and it's going to be broadcasted by the Knesset channel, so taking into account those who are going to tell us some secrets that although it's a committee of Foreign Affairs and Defense, but we are delighted to host this event of 100 years to the Balfour Declaration. And to be honest, I'm surprised that when trying to remember myself 50 years ago, or even 40 years ago, I don't remember that the Balfour Declaration was something that was a subject that we used to talk about. And today, if I'm taking the last 10 years, I think from year to year there's an increasing number of Israelis in all ages who know what is it Balfour Declaration. And I think it's something that for us, it gives me, I think it gives all Israelis, all Jewish people worldwide, a good feeling that more and more people, at least Jews, but I'm not sure that just Jews, are familiar with the title, the Balfour Declaration. I'm delighted to host here two members of the UK House of Lords and the Parliament, Lord Stuart Pollack and the Honourable Joanne Ryan, and all other guests that we are hosting here, Jonathan Kestenbaum, of course, and Simon Shama, and Daniel Mayashin, and Professor Ephraim Karsh, and Professor Martin Kremer, and Mr. Yaakov Chaguel, who's supposed to be asked, maybe he'll join us later, and distinguished guests. And by mentioning all names, you are allowed not to mention the name of the continuation, so we'll be able to be more effective in using the time ahead of us. We are really delighted to open the event here at the Security and Foreign Affairs Committee. When 100 years ago, Lord Balfour just gave a declaration, a written one, that says His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. 100 years ago, in my eyes, it started the modern history by a non-Israeli institute that speaks about the right of Jews to build a home here in Eretz Israel. And I know that in many cases worldwide, we hear that the modern history started in 1967. So let me shed a bit of light about the real modern history, in my eyes. Balfour Declaration was the first phase. The second phase was 1947, when the Israeli Institute at that time accepted the partition plan that was confirmed by the United Nations Assembly in 29th of November 1947. Can you imagine that at that time, 2 years after the Holocaust, after we lost 6 million of Jewish people, including many family members of myself, can you imagine that 2 years after, the Jewish Institute in Israel accepted the partition plan that says that we are getting only 55% of the land between the Jordan Valley and the Mediterranean, that half of the Galilee is not going to be Israeli, the seashore is going to be very narrow, a crossing at the Israeli valley from the east side of the Galilee into the seashore. And the Gaza Strip was 10 times bigger than it is today. 10 times bigger. The North Pole of the Gaza Strip was near Rehovot, post Yavne. I'm living in Ashkelon, so I would be here to brief you as a citizen of the Arab state. And above all, Jerusalem was not under Israeli sovereignty. Can you imagine that the Jewish administration at that time accepted a partition plan that the state of Israel will not include Jerusalem under its sovereignty? I'm telling you, today it can't work as a joke. But nevertheless, we accepted it. But as usual, the Arabs saved us. They rejected the partition plan, waged a war, 7 armies of 7 countries, and the independence war started. The third phase was 1949, when the war was ended, when Israel got 78% of the land, including the whole Galilee, wider seashore, and the whole Negev. And the part of Jerusalem, the west side of Jerusalem, without the holy places for Jewish people, like the Western Wall, the Old City, Rachel Tomb, etc. So that's the third phase. The fourth phase is 67. But not the result of the war, the beginning of the war. Because in 1967, we all remember, during May, Gamal Abdel Nasser, at that time the president of the Egyptian Republic at that time, he waged a war against Israel, or he blocked the straits that lead to Eilat, kicked off all United Nations troops from Sinai and Gaza Strip, and we well understood that it's going to be opened a war, and like we say in translation to a saying, before they're going to have us for dinner, we're going to have them for lunch. And that's what happened. So we are sorry you won the war against Egypt in 67. So it created the 67 line, which means the 49 line of post-independence war. King Hussein, the king of Jordan, was loud and clear, heard from the Israelis, we don't have any intention to open fire against Jordan. But he was convinced by Gamal Abdel Nasser more than he was convinced by Israelis. And Gamal Abdel Nasser convinced him that they are winning the war against Israel in the south. We taped it, as you know, as you heard the phone call between both of them. And King Hussein thought it's a good idea to open a war and to get back the piece of Jerusalem we lost during the independence war. Unfortunately, it didn't work. And we took all Jerusalem and all the West Bank, and we got back to the holy places, and we finished the mission of our independence war. That's how 67 line was created, post-49. So, if we want to start with the modern history, we have to start with Balfour Declaration. And I'm sure that today people who are going to speak about it will remember very well the fact that the State of Israel was not established in one shot. It took time from the Declaration by non-Israeli institution or non-Jewish institution, and was ended in the 67 war, that these are the borders that we are sitting there up until today, including in Jerusalem, and we are delighted to host you here in Jerusalem knowing that we have free access, unlimited access to all our religious places like any other person, whether he's Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or any other religious or non-religious at all. He can go everywhere, literally, without any limits. So I'm glad that we are celebrating here today 100 years to the Balfour Declaration, which in my eyes opened the modern history, as I said before. And I'll be delighted to hand over to Lord Stuart Pollack to brief us, please.
Well, first of all, let me thank you, Mr. Gifter, and the committee for hosting us on this great day. To be here in Jerusalem to mark and celebrate the 100 years of Balfour is very special indeed. I don't want to take up a long time, and it's good that here we're sort of cross-party. Both Joan and Lord Kestenbaum are from the Labour Party, and I'm from the Conservative Party. We're delighted that all of us are here to celebrate. I only have to start the day is to something I've said previously, and I continue to say it, and it's sort of often forgotten. And everyone talks about, especially those opponents, they talk about the two parts of the Balfour Declaration. The promise of a Jewish homeland for the Jewish people, not to do anything that will change the position, the civil rights of the other non-Jews in the land. But you know, it doesn't finish. One of the problems I've always had is that everyone just assumes that it's two parts. And I read you the last part, so we're very clear. Because it says that it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, which everybody quotes. Everybody forgets to quote that that's not the end of the sentence. Or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. It says that. That's what Balfour wrote. And I would argue that in 1948, there were two groups of refugees that were created as a result of the important Declaration of the State. The Palestinians, we know, and we hear about, and the United Nations talks about, and does more than just talking. And then there's the Jews of the Arab lands, 850,000, the historians will give me the exact number, 850,000 Jews of Arab lands who, think of the scenario, it was a few years after the Holocaust, and the Jews of Arab lands left their homes, left their businesses, came in the clothes that they were, and what do we hear about them today? There have been about 170 United Nations resolutions about the Palestinians. There have been 13 UN agencies about the Palestinians, and there's been tens of millions, probably billions of dollars spent. And on the Jews of Arab lands, no resolutions at all. And I just remind people, as we begin this day of commemoration and celebration, that the whole of the Balfour Declaration should be taken in full, and the last sentence should not be forgotten. But having said that, of course, as I say, we're delighted that we're here and to discuss and to celebrate the Balfour Declaration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the microphone is yours, Honourable Joanne, Member of Parliament. Joanne Ryan.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for inviting me to be with you today at this special event to celebrate the Balfour Declaration. I consider it a huge honour to be here. I am incredibly proud of Britain's role in helping to bring about the world's first Jewish state, and equally proud of the part played by my party. Labour declared its support for the Zionist cause 3 months before Balfour's letter, when it published its War Aims Memorandum. In it, the party endorsed Jewish claims to settlement in Palestine. When the Balfour Declaration was published later that year, Labour's leader, Arthur Henderson, and his successors, Ramsay MacDonald and George Lansbury, welcomed the government's stance. And when others subsequently wavered, Labour kept the faith. In 1935, Labour's new leader, Clement Attlee, spoke of the party's support for a national Jewish home in Palestine for the Jewish people. In Parliament, Labour MPs voted against the MacDonald White Paper in 1939, which shamefully attempted to shut off Jewish immigration at the very moment when Europe's Jews faced maximum peril. Labour's support for Balfour was endorsed by party conferences in the late 1930s and during the 1940s, with the party's last wartime conference declaring a Jewish national home was now irresistible in the face of the unspeakable atrocities committed by the Nazis. As the former Labour Prime Minister and great friend of Israel, Harold Wilson, later remarked, it would not have been possible for a political party to be more committed to a national home for the Jews in Palestine than was Labour. But I'm here this morning not just to mark the events of 100 years ago, but to celebrate the state that it helped lead to. For me, Israel is a beacon of democracy and the rule of law in the Middle East, a model to which its neighbours should aspire. A state where free trade unions stand up for working people. An independent judiciary and press that speak truth to power. And where the rights of women, the LGBT community and other minorities are respected and celebrated. I believe Labour's founding fathers would have felt that their support for Zionism more than justified. In recent times, it may not always seem so, but in my party, it continues to be a home to many who are steadfast in their support of Israel. On a personal note, I want to briefly mention my great friend, the former chair of Labour Friends of Israel, David Cairns. Some of you will remember. David passed away at a tragically young age some 6 years ago. Israel had few better friends in Britain than David, and he would have so loved this occasion. In his last speech, he explained his passionate support for Israel thus: it's because Israel embodies progressive values that I am a proud friend of Israel. That's why modern-day Labour leaders, Harold Wilson, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, have been amongst Israel's staunchest friends. And it's why I and many of my parliamentary colleagues are, in David's words, proud friends of Israel. It's not just Israel's commitment to democracy, the rule of law, and its respect for the rights of minorities which we admire. Today, Israel is an economic powerhouse. Your investment in education, science and innovation, and a strong partnership between private sector and government has produced a high-tech miracle on the Mediterranean from which Europe has much to learn. Trade between Britain and Israel is now worth close to £5 billion a year, tying our two countries closer together and showing that for all its noise, the BDS movement is fighting a losing battle. Many believe that there is a trade-off between economic vigour and compassion. I have never believed that, and Israel shows that it does not have to be that way. Nothing to me encapsulates this better than the work of Israel, today delivering vital humanitarian aid across the globe, in Puerto Rico, Mexico, Sierra Leone, South Sudan, the Philippines, to name just 5 examples. I want also to take this opportunity to thank the IDF and Israel's doctors and nurses for the remarkable work they are carrying out on the northern border, caring for the victims of Syria's terrible civil war. And let me just say, the contrast between the actions of Israel and Iran in Syria speaks volumes. Of course, the realisation of the Zionist dream in 1948 brought with it many new obstacles. Some of them against great odds Israel overcame. Others remain unresolved. As you face the challenges of the future, I want to make this pledge. Naturally, I've spoken today a great deal about my own party, but Israel has many friends on both sides of the House, as Lord Pollock has said. And I know that I speak on behalf of us all when I say that together we will continue to work ceaselessly to promote the cause of peace between Israel, the Palestinians and the wider Arab world, to challenge constantly terror and those who incite, justify and excuse it, and fight relentlessly the campaign to delegitimise Israel and deny the Jewish people's right to self-determination. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to call a member of Knesset, Hilik Bar, who is chairing the British-Israeli Friendship Committee in the Knesset. Hilik, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be short, but I will tell you that I'm very excited to be here. First, to meet great friends like the Right Honourable John Ryan, who is leading the Labour Front of Israel and doing amazing work to protect Israel in a party that is not always very easy to protect Israel. And I will stop here. I will try to be polite on this day. But thank you, John, for what you are doing. And Lord Pollack, you're also such a good friend of Israel. And we thank both of you on this day for struggling to keep the name of Israel inside the Labour Party and in England and the UK as a whole. And I think that the Balfour Declaration was a very significant point in history when the UK had the chance to make a big favor not only to the Israeli state but to the Jewish people. We should never and will never forget that, even if some colleagues at the Palestinian Authority are trying to make people forget it or even to fight. Unfortunately, this very amazing thing that happened. I think, Avi, Mr. Chairman, that Britain used to have this very important role, but today we are not using, if I can say, using Britain enough and the friendship with the UK as a gate to Europe to make Israel better, stronger. I think that the UK is an amazing ally in Israel, and as MP Ryan said, we have great friends, not only at the Labour Party, of course, but in the entire Parliament. I visited the Parliament a few times and discovered how much of good friends we have in the UK and in Europe. And it's this point that I can say that Israel should enter more into a much more official involvement in Europe and try to make Europe understand the reality that Israel and the challenges that Israel is facing today. In my last visit at the EU Parliament, I discovered that the last Prime Minister that came formally to the EU Parliament, Avi, can you guess who it was? Yitzhak Rabin. It shouldn't be the case. I think that in Europe we have such an amazing friends. We have challenges, we have things to explain, we can debate, we can argue. But when I'm coming to the UK and Ambassador Daniel Taub was part of almost every visit I had until recently, I'm finding an allies and great friends of Israel. So on this very festive day, John and Lord Pollack, I want to thank you. I want to ask you to continue to explain Israel, to advocate for Israel, to argue with Israel about things that you think we should do, but to always not forget that you have a very big share in the existence of Israel, and that you have, together with us, of course, some responsibility for the continuation of a strong and viable Israel. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I hope that we'll be able to continue and celebrate this day through the entire day. And again, thank you very much for coming and for being such a great friend of Israel.
תודה רבה, חיליק בר. Congratulations for becoming a father for another daughter.
Yeah, thank you. I'm taking care of demography.
Some of us are taking care of the grandkids, you are taking care of the kids, it's okay. The next one is going to be Lord Kestenbaum, please. Can you take the microphone and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And as you say on this festive day, I wonder if you would allow me to start with two personal comments. The first is this is the first opportunity I've had to speak in a parliament outside our own. I can't help but observe the contrast. Those of you who are familiar with the House of Lords will know that it is a slightly intimidating, almost terrifying place. Been there almost 1,000 years and it feels that way. But to come here and to hear parliamentarians wish each other mazel tov on the occasion of the birth of a daughter is a very different experience. So I was delighted with that. My second personal comment in a day in which we're celebrating Britain and Israel is to pay tribute to what I regard as Britain's finest export, and that is Ambassador Tao, who has represented your country with great distinction. Following on from two very distinguished parliamentarians, I thought I would have a slightly different dimension to my few words, Chairman, if you wouldn't mind. My role over the last month or two was to chair the Balfour 100, which was essentially the British tribute to the Balfour Declaration, and it expressed itself in all sorts of ways. And what I'd like to do in these few minutes is not tell you what we did, but rather to try and draw out some of the lessons, particularly from the perspective of understanding the bilateral relation between Britain and Israel. I think that what happened over the last couple of weeks is a potential lesson for bilateral relations, and let me tell you what I mean. First of all, you'll know that this was a rather unusual coalition. It was 23 participating organizations. It was good-natured, it was unified. Some called that the second Balfour miracle, that it was pretty unified. And it was quite extraordinary in terms of the range, the breadth, and the dimension of activity from Plymouth to Edinburgh, as it was said last week. You know, the British are not good at bragging, as you know, but it was quite a success. It was quite an occasion. And last Thursday night, as many of you will know, was an unprecedented gathering across political, religious, and civic leadership to mark the Balfour Declaration in Britain. Your Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the Middle East Minister, the US Commerce Secretary were all there. Tony Blair was there, John Kerry was there. The leaders of all the churches were there, both archbishops, of course. The key ambassadors who played a role, their countries played a role in the Declaration, and of course, the descendants. We had there Winston Churchill's grandson, we had Mark Sykes' grandson, we had of course, Lloyd George's grandson, and of course the Rothschilds and the Balfours. Why do I make the point? It might not have been this way. The warnings that we got a year ago was the Jewish community will be apathetic, government will be anxious, and there will be a vast amount of public hostility on the streets. And I think one of the reasons I come today is to try and understand together with you why none of those things happened. Why was it that the Jewish community got galvanized and mobilized? Why was it that government and opposition were prepared to engage with this great celebration, and why was there no public hostility? Look, obviously, slightly tongue-in-cheek, I think one of the reasons why is that when Lord Rothschild asks people to do things, usually the answer is yes. You remember that lovely story about why was the declaration addressed to Lord Rothschild? And it was your own Nachum Sokolov who said, well, he said, the Zionists didn't have an address, whereas Lord Rothschild had a rather good address, number 148 Piccadilly. So the fact that Lord Rothschild, who you will see later on today, threw his weight behind it was important, but it wasn't everything. I think that there was a perfect storm in the finest sense of the word of alignment between our interests and Great Britain last week across three areas. And that's why I think it was a success. And let me tell you what I think they were. The first was it brought back to life the sense of shared purpose, which these great entities once had, Britain and at the time the Yishuv and now Israel. And you know, in retelling the story last week, as we continually did, a very Jewish activity, the activity of reenactment, I think what we were able to do was to shed light less on the things that divided us, Israel and Britain, and much more on the ties which bind these two countries. And in that sense, last week became a very catalytic experience. Less and less to do with the difficulties we have in bilateral terms, and more of a reminder of the shared purpose. And I think that's the first reason why there was such strong alignment last week. I think the second reason why there was strong alignment last week was that it evoked a sense of shared values. Talking again about the inspiration behind the Balfour Declaration reminded us, of course, that lovely story which Simon Sharma evoked in his masterful centenary lecture at the Royal Society last week. Very much it was an I was there moment, and when it does come onto the YouTube, you must watch it. And Simon reminded us that Lloyd George, in one of his early encounters with Weitzman, when Weitzman was talking about the various locations in the land of Israel, he said, you know, Dr. Weitzman, I recognize the biblical names that you are describing more clearly, I am more familiar with them than I am with the small villages in the Welsh valleys. Why do I make that point? Because it reminded us that there was a time when these two peoples and these two countries were bound by a sense of shared values. And what we reenacted last week, and what we reminded us of last week, is that when you do have those shared values between two countries, you very much go with the grain of shared interests. Shared values will underpin the shared interests. Yes, of course, as Sir Charles Webster, the historian, said, Weitzman's act was the greatest act of diplomatic statesmanship in the last 100 years. But equally, Balfour himself, at the end of his life, said, when I look back, and that was a very long political life of 45 years, when I look back on my life, the Balfour Declaration was the single most important political act of my entire career. So I think the second thing we evoked last week was shared values. I think third and finally, and of all of the things that I'd like to bring to your attention as a committee, this is the important one, the really important one. I think what we created last week was a shared language. You know, for the Brits, words matter. They've always mattered. The language that we tried to create, and again I have to pay tribute to Simon, who drew this to my attention a year ago. Think about the language. It wasn't shrill, it wasn't triumphalist, it was proud, it was dignified, and it emphasized common ties. It didn't ignore the work in progress, it wasn't deaf to some of the sensitivities, but it was dignified and it was proud. I can't stress enough how important the shared language was to creating that sense of alignment that we shaped last week. So in short, members of the committee, I think what I learned from the Balfour 100 festivities and the enormous success that they were is that this is a relationship which is at its worst when it's built on lecturing and hectoring and scrambling for the moral high ground, when it's built on a kind of zero-sum game. And it's at its very best, as we saw last week, when it evokes shared purpose, shared values, and above all, a shared language. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And the next speaker is going to be a member of Knesset, Eyal Ben Reuven.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you all for sharing with us this important day. I believe that this day that we notice the Balfour Declaration, I think it's important for of course, for the history of the Jewish people. I think it's very, very important to the history and for the future of the Middle East. Even I'm not sure that all the people in the Middle East like this day, but I think it's very, very important. And I think it's important for the history of the world and for the future of the world about these days. As our chairman said, I served 35 years in the military, and I don't remember that we noticed this day year after year with our soldiers. I remember about 2 hours in school, long time ago. I think in the last few years, we remember it more and more, and I think it's because of the reality of this area. It's become more and more complicated, and I think that this event of recognize empire, Jewish of a group of people, and create states. I think this is a very significant event. If I look for the history, I think this declaration, it was kind of light for the Jewish people, especially from 1917 to 1948, for the Independence Day, when the Jewish people didn't have a state, but it gave them kind of hope for the future. And I think it was, again, very difficult, very important. I believe that today we have all had to remember that Israel today is the only democracy in the Middle East. I even don't want to think what would happen without Israel here in this crazy area. I mean, we are, and I think that our place here is give kind of hope to the people, of course here in Israel, but I believe even in all our area, all around, because we are kind of model of a state who are very young, still young, but did very, very significant steps to be modernized, to be strong, to be democracy, which is not very simple in this in our world. I think that you have all can see, like MP John Ryan, I think your example about the people in Israel, how we behave with our neighbors in the north. When if you will come to visit in the hospital in Aria or in hospital in Tzfat, when you see our doctors take care, it's so exciting to take care about people from Syria, people that we fought with them how many times again and again. Now we are take care about them. You know, in my village, I live in the small village in the north. Every weekend, in Friday, there is some women who collect clothes for children, Syrian children. Every weekend we collect these clothes and send them to this. This is the people here in Israel. So I believe and I hope that all the area, all the states around us, the Palestinians, they are all will understand that the Balfour Declaration was the beginning of the state of Israel, and we are going to stay here forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Major General retired Yael Reuven, and Professor Simon Shama, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I too want to say how honoured and happy I am to be in Jerusalem, celebrating unapologetically the Balfour Declaration. But I find it very, very weird to be in a room full of Jews, all of whom seem to agree with each other.
You should always only go to the other rooms and you'll see. It's fine.
Well, I'm about to change that. So, the last thing I want to do is to be a party pooper, and I too was very honoured to be at the extraordinary celebrations in London last week, and Lord Castenbaum is quite right. All the Jeremiahs, including me, who thought there'd be much more of a strenuous battle for hearts and minds in Britain going on, were wrong. And he's also right that the stars are in alignment and they were worked perfectly by Lord Castenbaum and Lord Rothschild and others to make that so. But, in me you've got a historian who wants to talk about the future. And I will say that at that great meeting where Prime Minister Netanyahu and the two archbishops and Prime Minister May, one great thing we can all congratulate ourselves on is that the commemoration, the celebration of the Balfour Declaration drew from the beleaguered Prime Minister of the United Kingdom quite the best speech she's ever made. She was clearly a happy person at that. But what I do want to say is that I live in the world of the university partly, and in the world of the American university, as well as the British university. And there, Jonathan, the outlook doesn't always look so rosy. There, the word Zionist is a title of honour you have to fight for. Most often, as I know from my young Jewish student friends in the Pinsker Institute, they've called it an institute, a wonderful example of young Jewish men and women voluntarily getting together to think about the origins of Zion. They're only too aware that most usually the word Zionist is not used as something, as it ought to be, charged with nobility and decency, but some things, I say, you have to fight for. It's a term of reprobation, not the opposite. So what I want to talk to you about, just for a minute, since I've got you captive here, is soft power. Soft power. The soft power of Jewish history. If you talk to, yesterday, two of my beloved friends and colleague writers, Simon Sebek Montefiore and Howard Jacobson, the novelist who gave the Jerusalem lecture, I think last year, wrote a letter which was published in the Times, worrying about the way in which anti-Zionist rhetoric, particularly among the young, and alas, some parts of some political parties will be nameless, morphs these days into anti-Semitism. And some of the noise in social media was said, well, who do you think was living in what we now call Palestine before the Balfour Declaration? To which the answer is, Jews were living there. None of them know that, for example, there was a Jewish majority in Jerusalem from the 1860s onwards. None of them know that Safed and Tiberias were built by Jews in the 16th century. What they know about Jewish history consists essentially of two things: the Shoah and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They have no sense of the richness of Jewish history, of its complexity, and above all, its connection to some of the great epic moral dramas of the history of the world. The epic of homelessness, of everything our people has had to go through for thousands of years, denied the possibility of a home. That one word in the Balfour Declaration, home, is the key to its whole moral resonance. We are not doing enough to educate the non-Jewish world about Jewish history. I attempted to do a little bit about this when the BBC let me produce a series on television 5 years ago called The Story of the Jews. 4 million people in Britain, which has a population of 300,000 Jews, watch that series. But, television series come and go. They actually stick around these days more often, regrettably, than printed books, but they do come and go. often, as today, for the best possible reasons, we're talking just to each other. We have to talk to the rest of the world, not just in the decency and virtue of our political position and the rights to our defense, which are indisputable and unarguable. Those battles need to be fought in legislations and United Nations. They have to be fought against BDS, but they have to be fought with and for the future, for the young. And we have to think more about what we can tell all those people. We can tell them about Maimonides, about the poetry of Yehuda Halevi. We can tell them about the great Yiddish writing of Yehuda Leib Peretz. There are stories to tell which flow into why we're all sitting here today. They are not being told. They're not being told except by academics to other academics, by Jews to other Jews. It's time we took our story outward. The reason about the Declaration, one of the reasons why it succeeded, was because there was an educated sympathy between Arthur Balfour and between Lawrence Oliphant and between Lloyd George, as we've said, and the cause of the destiny of the Jewish people. That sympathy is under siege now, and we have to think creatively. The opening of the library opposite the building would be one great starting point. How to actually fill the world with the story of the Jews. Thank you.
The next speaker will be member of Knesset, Amir Ohana, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for our friends, for our good friends from overseas in the deepest sense of the word friendship, for your inspiring words and heartwarming words. Thank you for that. There's a story about Dr. Wiseman, Lord Kesselman, you mentioned him. They came to visit the House of Lords before the establishment of the state, of course, of Israel. And he was asked, my dear Mr. Wiseman, he was asked by one of the lords, why Palestine? Why what you call the land of Israel? Why wouldn't you try elsewhere? Maybe you would have less trouble, less enemies. You know, they were talking about Uganda. At that time, Herzl was seriously considering that option in light of the Kishinev riots and the sense of urgency that was common to the Jewish people. And he replied, my dear Mr. Lord, why do you drive 2 hours each weekend to visit your old mother in Brighton when you have a decently nice old lady just across the street? This story demonstrates what the land of Israel means to the Jewish people. And let's be honest, and very clear. When we say land of Israel, more than we mean Herzliya, Kfar Saba, Tel Aviv, we mean Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem, the places where we were created as a people. We mean Shiloh. If not Judea, Samaria, and Jerusalem, it might as well be Uganda. This is the reason we struggle and fight for this land. Now, is the land empty? By all means, it's not. Will we enjoy peace? I think yes. But it has nothing to do with going back to the 1967 borders, since we didn't have peace prior to 1967. And as we hear, unfortunately, in almost every pro-Palestinian demonstration, on European campus, on American campus, even on Israeli campus, because we do cherish the freedom of speech, as all other freedoms. It's still the same old slogan, saying, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And you know where it puts us, taking swimming lessons. And the only way in which we can achieve peace, live in peace with our neighbors, is based on 2 major pillars. One is education, the other is economy. When I say education, I mean the incitement to terror has to stop. And when I say economy, I mean look at those industrial zones of Judea and Samaria. Walk into the factories. What you would see there is remarkable. You would see Jews and Arabs working together, having lunch together, sharing family pictures, living together, rather than killing each other. This is coexistence. This is peace in the making. I don't think it will take years. It will probably take generations. But only based on those two major pillars, I would say peace is inevitable. Thank you.
תודה רבה, אמיר. The next speaker will be Daniel Not Tao. I know Tao. It's a more complicated name.
No question.
Mariashin, please, from Neighbor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to appear before the committee today. I feel especially privileged to sit before you today. Our first relative and our family arrived in this land in 1934 from Lithuania. Our cousin built a life here on the kibbutz, and she remained an ardent Zionist until her last day. But the family that she left behind, she was 20 years old when she came here. The family she left behind was killed in its entirety. So as I sit here, I think this building and you, the members of this body, are the living answer to the fate of our family lost in Lithuania. Well, this month there will be many commemorations of the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, the document that was the transformational catalyst for the Zionist movement in its quest to establish a sovereign Jewish state in the ancient homeland of its people. While the history of our people is one of millennia of dispersion, persecution, hardship, and travail, we've also been blessed over time with friends who have been understanding and sensitive to our condition. Lord Balfour stands in the front ranks of those friends, and we celebrate his initiative and foresight on our behalf. Well, now, 100 years on and 70 years since the establishment of the modern state of Israel, one would have hoped for a certain normalcy in its life among the community of nations. Well, in so many ways, Israel has achieved that normalcy, and in some important fields is a leader on a global scale. Sadly and regrettably, we're witnessing incessant campaigns to erase both the intent and the promise of the Balfour Declaration. At the United Nations, from the inception of Israel's membership in that body, the international stage provided by that organization has been the scene of countless speeches, resolutions, and behind-the-scenes efforts to demonize and delegitimize Israel. Today, the various bodies and agencies of the UN promote that effort almost on a daily basis. The 1975 Zionism equals racism resolution was only the tip of an iceberg of hate that now plays out in the Human Rights Council and at UNESCO. The current call for a boycott of Israeli products by the Human Rights Council only exposes the depth of bias and distaste for Israel. UNESCO and its World Heritage Committee have been used in an attempt to erase our history in this land. And even the World Health Organization, which hitherto had not been politicized, has been infected by this virus as well. You may recall that in June of 2016, the WHO adopted a resolution against Israel charging it with impeding the delivery of healthcare services to Palestinians. 107 countries voted for the resolution, including all the European countries present that day for the vote. This, notwithstanding the full knowledge that Israeli hospital emergency rooms treat all patients on the basis of the severity of their cases, that organizations like Save a Child's Heart, for example, have treated thousands of Palestinian children with severe heart problems. And as was mentioned earlier, the situation we see today in terms of treating Syrians as a result of the civil war in that country. The World Council of Churches continues to support the so-called Kairos Palestine document, which treats acts of terror as expressions of, quote, armed resistance, and which attempts, unbelievably, to create a theological basis for denying a connection between the Jewish people and Israel. Mr. Chairman, the BDS movement continues to enlist the aid of friends in high places. Only days ago, the UN's Special Rapporteur on the Palestinians, a position created only to castigate Israel, urged economic sanctions against it. And BDS has gone far beyond the university campus. In September, Canada's largest private sector union adopted a resolution calling for sanctions, quote, against sectors of the Israeli economy and society. Israel apartheid weeks are still very much evident on university campuses. An anti-Israel play, The Siege, was staged last month on the campus of New York University. It focuses on Palestinian terrorists who took over the Church of the Nativity in 2006, casting them as heroes. And just days ago, Alan Dershowitz, one of Israel's staunchest defenders, was recently attacked in the University of California at Berkeley's daily newspaper with a vicious anti-Semitic editorial cartoon. That the BDS campaign has failed in some respects does not detract from the reality that some large church groups, student organizations, and numerous NGOs spend time and resources to cast Israel as a, quote, colonialist, oppressive occupier, and which should have no legitimacy as a member of the family of nations. Now theirs is not a point of view and a debate about ideas. It is simply a campaign in the court of international public opinion to tear away Israel's underpinnings as a sovereign state and to deal it as much harm as possible. Mr. Chairman, as we commemorate this day as a monumental act of decency, whose purpose was to recognize the injustices of the past and the legitimate right of the Jewish people to live in peace and security in its own nation, there are those who engage in global campaigns to turn the clock back in order to deny our people that right. B'nai B'rith is proud of its role in support of the Balfour Declaration. Indeed, Chaim Weizmann once served as president of his B'nai B'rith Lodge in Manchester. We take great pride in participating in projects that contributed to the upbuilding of this land in its earliest days. We're proud of the ongoing efforts to advocate for a strong state of Israel in the face of chaos that roils this region today and which reverberates at the UN, in national capitals and houses of parliament, on university campuses, and among NGOs everywhere. And we are proud of our continued efforts to support Israel's standing everywhere, including our role as a founding member organization of Israel Aid. As we enter the next 100 years after 1917's seminal document was signed, written by Arthur Balfour, you can always count on B'nai B'rith for its passionate support and devoted partnership. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is member of Knesset Nachman Shai, former Brigadier General in the Army.
Thank you, Avi. And thank you all for coming this morning to the Knesset. I know many of you, and I'm really very happy to meet you here in such an important occasion. Professor Shana, actually, I'm additionally proud to hear you because that's what more or less the message I had in my mind today. Because when I think of the Balfour Declaration, it was the beginning of one stage, in the first stage in the diplomatic struggle of Israel to become, of the Jewish people to become independent and to establish our own home in this part of the world. And it has always been the same. Sometimes we tend to forget it and to neglect it. that we need to combat or to fight together the mix between military means and diplomatic ones. It is always together. It can't be only one of them. We tend to forget it sometimes when we focus too much on our military power, which is extremely important. But at the same time, Israel by itself can do very little if it doesn't have the support of the world community and of many states, of course, Britain included. And it was the case from the very beginning, and it's true today as well. This is one message. The other one was that Israel's soft power, the Jewish people's soft power, is not always mentioned and not always visible. And again, it's a combination of soft power and hard power together. Hard power, everyone knows. Well, Israel is a mini empire in this part of the world, regional empire. And it should be. But where is the history? Where are the roots? Where are the values that led Israel in its entire history? That's soft power. And again, only combination of hard power and soft power can carry us now and in the future as well. And I think this was in the heart of the Balfour Declaration. The history of the Jewish people and the need of the Jews to have their own state. Even today, I think that it leads us and should in the entire in the world community. Again, a mixture of values and interest. That, I believe, stands between us and Great Britain today. It's not only about values, it's interest as well. It's not only about interest, it values as well. And we have to find a way to combine them both in order to keep the same friendship between the two people and the two states for many years to come. As a Palestinian who was born under the government of Her Majesty in the year 1946, and that's what the birth certificate in my office says, I'm very proud to meet you today, to thank you for letting me become an Israeli citizen 2 years later, and to thank you very much for everything you've done for Israel in the past, and will do for Israel and for people in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ahmad. Next speaker will be Professor Ephraim Karsh. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint Professor Shama because I'm not going to disagree with him. In fact, I'm going to emphatically agree, having spent my entire academic career at a major British university, King's College London. I'm fully aware of how difficult it is to be a Zionist and at times even a Jew. British academic system. I recall when I just arrived there about 30 years ago, one of my departmental colleagues, European historian, by no means anti-Semitic or not even an anti-Israeli, asked me with great astonishment, how can you be a Zionist? And I said, look, do you think the Jews have the right to have their own state like any other nation? He said, yes, of course. I said, oh, well, you're a Zionist now. So, if this is the view in British universities, perhaps we shouldn't be angry at Mr. Abbas, who at the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration asked Britain to apologize and even compensate the Palestinians for this supposed crime, even though I'm not sure the compensation will go well with Britain today at Brexit when the Europeans ask quite a lot of money. But still I find it there is a major historical irony in this because 100 years ago, when the Balfour Declaration was issued, its importance is not only in the fact that the largest power on earth at the time recognized the Jewish right to national self-determination. Balfour Declaration, by the way, we all know it here, but many people are unaware. They say that they think the Balfour Declaration, the declaration of the Foreign Secretary, rather than a government declaration, it was governed official declaration that was negotiated for quite a long time, and Balfour basically was the messenger. But the most important thing, I think, about the Balfour Declaration was the rapidity with which it was accepted by the international community. Already before the declaration was issued, the British government got the approval of American President Woodrow Wilson. Immediately after it was issued, most members of the Entente fighting the war against Germany and the Ottoman Empire approved it. It was incorporated into the August 1920 agreement rearranging the Ottoman Empire, the Sevres Agreement as it was called, and in 1922 it was accepted by the League of Nations when it issued the mandate. And this was not only a practical recognition, it was a soft power recognition if we go to the terminology just used, because it issued the mandate for Palestine, which was of course the incorporation of the Balfour Declaration, the mandate to establish a national home for the Jews in Palestine, not only because some vague reason, but because, as it mentioned, the historical connection of the Jews to Palestine. So basically the entire international community recognized this right already 100 years ago, and the more interesting thing is, of which I think many people are unaware today, and this is the thing that I'll be speaking later on, is that the Muslim and Arabic-speaking world accepted it as well. Starting with the Ottoman Empire, yeah, okay, they didn't accept the Balfour Declaration, but almost a year later, in August 1918, the Grand Vizier, Talat Pasha, issued a very similar declaration, which even went further than the Balfour Declaration, because it acknowledged the Jewish religious and national rights to national home in Palestine, provided nothing will be done to the minorities, albeit they did mention the other part that you mentioned before, because the Ottoman Empire was not bothered about its own Jews in the way the British jury or some people in the cabinet at the time, I think it was called the Assyrian by law, who was afraid that it would affect them. Then was the leader of the One Arab movement, Emir Faisal, who not only accepted the principle, but signed even an agreement with Weizmann to implement the resolution. Of course, he reneged on it later, but nevertheless, it was there. Then was his brother, Emir Abdallah, who accepted it. And moreover, there are leaders of the Pan-Arab movement that Weizmann met in Cairo. He went to Cairo a few months after the declaration to convince them, and they accepted, including the Khedive, later king of Egypt, Fuad. In fact, the governor of Alexandria celebrated the Balfour Declaration with the Jewish community there. Above all, and here I come to Mr. Abbas' home care, the Palestinian Arabs were not opposed to it. Most of them were not aware that it was issued, and those who were didn't care. On the contrary, if you look at the history of Palestinian Arab relations with the Jewish Palestinian relations at the time, under the mandate from 1920 to 48, most of it was cooperation, collaboration, not violence. Violence was instigated by the extremist leadership, was short time, focused, narrowed, 29, even in 36, 39, when there was the so-called Arab Revolt, the collaboration continued. It continued even during the Second World War in many respects. And the Nazis reported with much consternation that the Jews and Arabs in Palestine are tired of the conflict. So I suggest that Mr. Abbas takes heed of what these people realized only 100 years ago, and instead of atavistically deriving the Balfour Declaration, he can show his real interest in peace by endorsing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shai. Next speaker, a member of the Knesset, Dr. Anat Berko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Professor Karch, for the historic background that you gave, so it saved me a lot of time. Thank you. From that point, I would say that the Palestinian, first of all, it's a great pleasure to have you here in the Knesset, and thanks for coming. And I think that it's very, very important session here today. And we miss the Arab members from the Knesset members that are not here And I'm sure that they wouldn't be here also when we'll have the assembly session about the Balfour Declaration, because from them, it's not different from Abu Abbas or Hamas. It's not a state aside Israel, a Palestinian state aside Israel, but instead of Israel. And we see that they are speaking right now about 100 years ago, the Balfour Declaration. They are not speaking about 48 or 67 war. They go to that time, back to the history, to try to delegitimate the right of the Jewish state to be here in our historic land. The other thing that we see right now that not different from the new anti-Semitism is the BDS phenomenon that I, as a person, an academic scholar that gave a lot of lectures abroad, know more than 12, 13 years that every time when somebody has come from Israel or to talk something related to the conflict, and God forbid even to say any critique about the Palestinian demonstration, and in America, in the US, you need to have a policeman in the audience to be able to deliver an academic lecture. So there is no academic freedom of speech even in the West. And what we see right now, that a lot of people, even parliamentarians that I meet, and I'm sure that my colleagues also know that, from Europe, know nothing about the history, nothing about what is going on here. And when they are speaking about apartheid, actually, I would say the apartheid are against those who are serving in the army, who are paying the taxes, who are doing for their own country. And many times you can ask, when you have this challenge, even in the parliament, in the Knesset, that you have a party that as a whole delegitimizes the state and speaking against the state and sometimes even commit terrorism. And we had a Knesset member that smuggled cell phones to security prisoners, terrorists. And he's a Knesset member, and he was a Knesset member many years. And not longer, but with my legislation, you wouldn't be able to come back. But now we can come back. So the problem is that the lies about the Palestinian territories or historic Palestinian state or something like that, it's a big lie. And we see that, and we can say, why the Ottomans didn't give the Palestinian a state? Why they didn't do that? They could do that. They were Muslims. And today, when the Palestinians demonstrate against the Balfour Declaration, and they want compensations like the Jews got from the Germans, this actually went too far. We would say that even Jordan, that should be part of Israel in the Balfour Declaration, could be something that nobody speaks about. So just to say the bottom line, instead of dealing with delegitimized Israel, the Palestinians deal with create their own nation aside Israel. But they don't do that. They try to steal our identity, our actually deep connection, historic connection to Jerusalem, and to say that they have the historical connection to this part. I would say that even in our three monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the Jewish state is for Israel. So if the Palestinians want to sue somebody, they can sue even Allah, because Bani Israel in Arabic, in their own Quran, is for Israel. They are speaking even in their own Quran about the state of Israel. So we need just to emphasize 200 years ago, still today, the Palestinians that actually speaking out and saying, yeah, we want peace, some of them, it's not the real intention. And the real intention is not a state beside us, but a state instead of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Professor Martin Kramer, please.
Thank you, Chairman Dichter. Anniversaries serve many purposes. Some are useful for present politics, and the Balfour Centenary.
Martin, דבר למיקרופון.
Is that better? Is it better?
Yeah.
Yes, good, thank you. Well, this anniversary served many purposes. Some are useful for present politics, and the Balfour Centennial is certainly that, both for Israelis and for Palestinians alike. But in this committee, I think it's appropriate to stress another purpose. It's to learn a lesson about how to prepare Israel for the future, and the lesson of the Balfour Declaration is this. Israel needs a diversified diplomacy and can't afford to rely on one power alone. Now, this may strike you as a paradox. The Balfour Declaration has the appearance of a unilateral statement of intent by the British War Cabinet. It was signed by the British Foreign Secretary, addressed to a leader of British Jewry for conveyance to the Zionist Federation of England and Ireland. On the face of it, the Declaration appears to be a singularly British commitment and a triumph of Zionist diplomacy in Britain. It is an Anglo-Zionist story. Well, it is that, but if that were all it was, we wouldn't have gotten the Balfour Declaration. The Declaration was a seemingly unilateral act, but the real story is that it was done by Britain with the consent of the Allied powers. These included France in the first instance, but also Italy and the United States. It may surprise you to know that the Balfour Declaration was approved by the Allies even before it was issued. If the Allies hadn't done so, the British would have dropped the whole thing. And that they did so was a result of Zionist and not British diplomacy. Well, let me explain. In 1916 and 1917, Britain was fighting a desperate war, dependent on the support of its allies. It was especially solicitous of France, where it was fighting on the Western Front. When it came to conquered territory, if any ally had any claim to it, Britain made no commitment without prior consultation. Palestine fell exactly into this category. France, Russia, and Italy all had interests in Palestine, and in 1916, in the famous Sykes-Picot Accord, Britain agreed to shared rule over Palestine, along with France and Russia and Italy. But Lloyd George, when he became Prime Minister at the end of 1916, thought that this gave too much to the Allies, especially France. Britain didn't want other powers so close to the Suez Canal, but how could Britain justify a superior claim? Mark Sykes, who did the earlier Sykes-Picot Treaty, came up with the expedient of British support for Zionism. It was brilliant. But Britain still insisted on the agreement of the Allies, and France was essential. The Zionists asked the British to secure that agreement, but Mark Sykes surprised them. You, he told the Zionists, have to do the work. After a very short deliberation, the Zionists gave the task to Nachum Sokolov. Now, Sokolov, I think, is a perfect instance of the erosion of memory over time. In his day, he was seen as the equal of Chaim Weizmann, but no drama can sustain two heroes, and with the passage of time, Sokolov was written out of the story. But forgetting Sokolov has resulted in the loss to history of the international dimension of the Balfour Declaration. So let's briefly reconstruct it. Why did the Zionists choose Sokolov? He was a polyglot, fluent in every European language, always turned out in a fine suit and a monocle. Someone once called him a diplomat in the class of the Quai d'Orsay, the French Foreign Ministry, someone who comported himself as though he naturally belonged to the diplomatic club. So off Sokolov went. His aim, first, to persuade the French that the Zionists, once installed in a national home in Palestine under British protection, would still be amenable to the French. He began by meeting with the French diplomats, the famous Picot, Sykes-Picot. Then he met with the higher-ups in the Quai d'Orsay, and even with the French Prime Minister. No one expected him to succeed, but he did. Most importantly, he got the French to issue him a now forgotten commitment, the Cambon Letter of June 4th, 1917, 5 months ahead of the Balfour Declaration. The Cambon Letter recognized the justice of the Zionist cause as reparation for their long exile from their land. Once Sokolov had it, he deposited it in the British Foreign Office for Balfour's future use. He did more. Sokolov went to Rome. He got a favorable expression of support from the Italian government. Even got an audience with Pope Benedict XV. The Catholic Church in 1917 was no friend of the Jews, and a previous pope had thrown Herzl out on his nose. But this one told Sokolov that in Palestine, the Zionists and the church would be good neighbors. America entered the war in the spring of 1917 as an ally against Germany, and so now the American president, Woodrow Wilson, also had to be persuaded. And this was no easy task. The Arabists of the old Protestant missionary type lobbied against Zionism. But on a previous trip to America, Sokolov had recruited a jurist named Louis Brandeis to the Zionist cause. And since then, Wilson had appointed Brandeis as a Supreme Court justice. Brandeis pressed Wilson, and Wilson finally approved the text of the Balfour Declaration only days before the crucial British cabinet meeting. In that meeting, the hard question posed by the doubters was the attitude of Britain's allies. And thanks to Zionist diplomacy, Balfour could tell the cabinet that the French and the American allies were fully on board. He even read the Cambon letter out loud to the cabinet. Thus was born the Balfour Declaration. Not a British declaration, but an allied one. Remember, in 1917, there was no United Nations, not even a League of Nations. There was no place where a vote could be taken. There was only the consensus of the Allies, and this the Zionists had secured. In 1930, Lloyd George, looking back, said this, and I quote him, "The Balfour Declaration was a gesture not merely on our part, but on the part of the Allies. It was prepared after much consultation, not merely of its policy, but of its actual wording by the representatives of all the Allied and associated countries, including America." End of quote. So, and here I conclude, the Balfour Declaration wasn't a unilateral chess move by a single imperial power. It was the product of a multilateral process of international legitimation, as much as a UN Security Council resolution might be today. The full story deepens the legitimation of Israel, and it shows how Zionist diplomacy in many capitals achieved more than if it had been fixed only on one. It is a valuable lesson for Israel to take forward, and perhaps there's none as valuable as this one. Thank you.
Daniel Taub, half Israeli, half British, former ambassador to England. Please.
Thank you very much, Abby. Thank you for hosting this session. Maybe just to pick up on 2 points which strike me as being very significant in the course of this discussion. The first is, I think, a number of speakers, Simon Schama and Nachman Shai, have very rightly encouraged us to think about the Balfour Declaration not simply as a what, as an issue of content, an issue of values, an issue of rights, but also as an example of how. As an example of a remarkable feat of diplomacy. Lord Kestenbaum described, quoting a historian, the remarkable diplomacy of Chaim Weizmann. I sometimes think that perhaps the best term that we can use to describe the campaign against the legitimacy of Israel is an Altneu threat. It's an Altneu threat in the sense that in one sense it's Neu, it's using all the skills, the facilities of modern communications and social media, but it's also Alt in the sense that it's a throwback to a historic opposition to the very idea of a Jewish state. And that says to me that we need to have an Altneu response. We need to be literate and effective in our use of modern communications. But we also need to revisit all of those remarkable skills that Weizmann, Sokolov, and an unbelievable group of individuals with little formal diplomatic experience, but with astonishing diplomatic instincts, used to reach out, to educate. Before anybody had thought of the term soft power, they were soft powering through the salons of Europe to remarkable effect. And I think that's something that in order to convey some of the history that we heard from Ephraim Karsh and Martin Kramer from Anat Berko, those are the skills that we're going to have to use. And the second point I would say is at the end of a week of truly remarkable events marking the Balfour Declaration, I think that we're doing something quite remarkable. I think that everybody who touches on the Balfour Declaration has to a certain degree mixed feelings about its history. And the history is complex. Palestinians have made it quite clear their mixed feelings. In Britain also there are a certain degree some mixed feelings. And we shouldn't forget that as Israelis, we also have justifiably a parallel history to the history that we're celebrating that reminds us that large parts of historic Palestine were carved off, and at the moment that we needed it most, entry into this national home of the Jews was close to us. But I think what we are doing when we celebrate the Balfour Declaration is that we are recognizing that by choosing our history, we are choosing our future. We are taking from our history what it is that we most want to see in our future relationship. And we are saying that we are choosing this moment, this high point of what Lord Kastenbaum talked about, the shared values, the shared language between Israel and Britain, to say that this is the future that we want to see. We're recognizing the fundamental principle between Israel and the UK as between other countries. We are at our best when we are at our closest. And I think that's the statement that we're making when we choose to celebrate this day.
Last speaker is member of Knesset, Rachel Azaria, please.
Hi. So I won't be talking about the history of the Balfour Declaration. You're much more outspoken and much more knowledgeable of that. I do want to say a few words about my grandfather. My grandfather, Professor Gerald Friedman, he was born in Germany. He escaped when he was 16. He helped his younger sister. She was on the kinder transport. He helped when he escaped to England. And he worked very hard to help his family leave Germany. When he arrived in England, he turned Balfour into his hero. And throughout the years, he collected letters written by Balfour. That was part of his thing. And he said that he has so much. He's so thankful to Balfour because during those hard times when he was in England and he knew his entire community is being burnt down together with all the Jewish community in Europe, it reminded him that there were people in Europe that were pro the Jews and weren't necessarily against us. And he also knew that there is a future and there's hope and that one day history would change. And the fact that the Declaration of Balfour, the Balfour Declaration, was before World War II, I'm sure that just like my grandfather, there were many Jews throughout Europe that gave him a lot of hope for a different future. And 100 years later, I can say that their hope was true and accurate, and here we are celebrating this declaration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. Last remarks, Lord Pollack.
Well, on behalf of your guests, can I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting us for this historic moment. It's been moving for me, I guess, for all of us to be here today. So thank you for that. And I'll finish with two very short things. One of the organisations that actually is mentioned in the Balfour Declaration, of course, is the Zionist Federation, which was mentioned. And I have to mention that the chairman of the present-day Zionist Federation, Paul Shani, is here with us, and I think that should be noted. And if I may, Simon talked about the Prime Minister's speech, the British Prime Minister's speech. By the way, the Israeli Prime Minister gave an amazing speech too, and you should look at that. But if I can close with something from us, where I quote the British Prime Minister of last week. In one part she talked and said that criticising the actions of Israel is never and can never be an excuse for questioning Israel's right to exist, any more than criticising the actions of Britain could be an excuse for questioning our right to exist. And criticising the government of Israel is never and can never be an excuse for hatred against the Jewish people, any more than criticising the British government will be an excuse for hatred against the British people. Put simply, she said, there can be no excuse for any kind of hatred towards the Jewish people. There never have been, and there never will be. And to close on this sort of 100 years of where we are, I suppose I'm grateful that the British Prime Minister gets it and understands it. And again, thank you, Mr. Dichter, for this great occasion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all speakers, and of course to the guests who crossed the Mediterranean up here, let alone those who crossed the Atlantic Ocean. But I met yesterday with Prime Minister Netanyahu after we got back from London, and he was really deeply impressed by the event, by the talk, by the words, by the atmosphere. And even though we had during the past many misunderstandings or disagreements with our great sister, if I may call, the United Kingdom, we adopted so many issues from the system that the United Kingdom is running itself for so many years, and we are just the small, the young brother or sister, almost 70 years old. I remember years ago, I was asked, when I was head of Shin Bet, I was asked by my counterpart, the MI5 at that time, leader, to send, during the terror attacks at the tubes in London, she asked me if I can send to a conference someone who is an expert in interrogation to explain how does it work in Israel. So I sent the head of the division, and then I got a call after the conference, and she told me, Abi, you cannot imagine what happened. He started to describe how we are questioning with terrorists, how the system works, and then started Q&As. After a few questions, one of the attorney generals who was there, or legal advisors, raised his hand and asked him, can you elaborate a little bit, how do you do it in Israel? According to what law you're doing it? He said, well, it's according to the 45th command. So he said, what do you mean 45 command? It's our commands. I said, yeah. You still keep our commands in Israel in fighting terrorists? He said, yes. Why are you doing it? He didn't know what to answer. He looked at him and said, in case you're going to be back. And he meant, in case you're going to be back as visitors. So I kindly invited to be back and again and back. We are delighted having you here. Thank you very much. The session is closed. Thank you.